the world needs your big feelings. We just need to have some skills around getting better at how we actually relate to those and how we express those.
This is Interfering Neurotic with me, Dr. Ash King, and mindfulness coach Darren Larson, where we navigate a life lived with the curses and blessings of big feelings. This ep is Feeling Your Feelings 101. We explore the difference between feelings and emotions, how to tease apart physical versus emotional sensations, why sense making gets in the way of us feeling feelings in our bodies, my dating life and how it feels, literally. And we leave you with a mini challenge to try out in your own life to work at becoming a better emotional connoisseur. Hello, good morning, good evening, whatever time it is, wherever you are. You're listening to Interfering Neurotic, and it is Emotions 101 episode today. We're going to be diving into the emotional experience. So we thought that we'd kick the episode off today with a little bit of emotions wrapped. I know that everyone's getting into their Spotify wrapped at this time of year, reflecting on the music that got them through the years. But what about our top emotions of 2024? We've nicked this from Hayley Weaver, and Hayley drew this as her Instagram handle. So, Darren, howdy. What do you reckon your top emotions of 2024 are?
Hey Ash, I love this game. So I have to say, a couple that come to mind immediately are with the grandparenting theme. I have had these moments of just pure delight, bedtime reading to my grandson, watching my granddaughter. There's also the heartbreak of leaving because I don't live super close. I have to travel to get there, right? And I also say a theme for my year, if I look back honestly in review, there's a lot of unpleasant emotion that I wake up with in the morning that doesn't really seem to be tied to anything specific. So it's just a thing. It's kind of a theme of my mornings often. So that's what comes to mind.
Do you have a name for that emotion?
Oh gosh. I call it, I know we have talked about it a little bit already. I call it like a high emotional idle, but it's kind of it feels like a dread. It feels like a physical sensation that conveys kind of a dread, kind of
Mm.
ominous. I don't love it, but it's a familiar quality of my waking up. So I've sort of incorporated it as this is what it feels like to wake up often is a
Mm-hmm.
little bit of dread that might not mean anything. So,
Mm.
how about your unwrapped? What's on here for the year?
Wow. Well, it's been an eclectic genre of emotions for me this year. Some that I wished that I didn't have to be living through, but we don't always get that option, do we? Uh,
Right.
so, yeah, the algorithm of our feelings is really just pulled by the world that we're living in and the experiences that we're having. I think the top one for me is heartbreak, which is obvious, but that's kind of its own smoothie of
Mm,
emotions. So, there's a lot that goes into heartbreak. And there has been times when I've been sitting with my practice and going, this is what being brokenhearted feels like. It's what being
mm,
brokenhearted feels like for me. I think loss, grief, and loss, if we can couple those together, has been a feature in there. I think, along with heartbreak, I think love. I've felt a greater sense of love and gratitude, perhaps to the people in my network who have basically kept me from completely falling under. And, maybe a sense of cautious hopefulness as well for me. There's a little bit of trepidation moving into wanting to be hopeful. And I guess the anxious part of me
mm,
tends to go, whoa, now, let's not imagine too many great things happening for you because there are a lot of terrible things that could happen. And just look at this
mm.
past year as proof and evidence. So, yeah, those would be mine.
Yeah, that's a lot. There's a ton to unpack there. Yeah, so what I hope we can do is I love some of the analogies you're using, and I hope we can draw from them as we continue to talk today. But one of my favorite themes in the world is something that I often feel a little bit like there's not enough people in the world who speak this language. So to talk about emotions with you is so exciting because I know at least if I sound odd or confusing, you'll ask the right questions and we can kind of make sure we're understanding each other. So, we talked at the end of our last conversation about this, about let's talk about emotions and specifically, are there some ways we can employ mindful awareness into the investigation of our emotions when we're feeling them. And that's what I'd love for us to kind of focus on today. And I want to put this on the table. Most of the time we're talking about social expression. Other people see us crying or laughing or looking down. So we're trying to interpret each other and we're trying to behave in a way that's consistent with how we feel. But for the purpose of this conversation, I would like to talk about that felt sense, like a bodily sense of what's it like to have a range of emotions. And something you said already hooked me a little bit was when something happens that's bad, if we look closer, there are these unpleasant elements, but it's also riddled with pleasant, warm, supportive things as well. So I love that. I love this idea of it being complex and letting it be complex.
I think the
Yeah.
neurotic experience calls for this because I don't think that unless you have incredibly emotionally attuned caregivers and teachers throughout, primary school and high school, and then relationships with partners who are very adept at navigating emotional experiences and communication, that people who do have big feelings need greater opportunities to understand what it is that they're feeling in ways that aren't hostile to themselves.
Yeah. And that's the thing. I'm kind of always listening for, especially on social media, but from the world of psychology, like I'm listening for this part of the conversation. I often hear this level of exploration and acceptance that happens at a very abstract level, almost like epiphany focused or insight or breakthrough. And you read something and it says, "Oh, don't worry about that because things could be like a stoic would tell you. Don't things could be worse." I'm like, "Okay, yeah, but that's not what I'm talking about." I'm talking about actually so often, I think when we are sharing our feelings with each other, we're talking about stories and circumstances and situations. I'm telling you my thoughts about my feelings.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we have enough really shared language around, no, like what I literally felt in my body. What does that dread feel like when you wake up in the morning? What does heartbreak feel like to you in your body?
Yes.
And knowing that it's going to feel different for different people. So I like to turn to Lisa Feldman Barrett as my favorite. I don't know. I see her as kind of a disruptive psychologist. I don't know if she sees herself that way. I feel like she's trying to tell you guys, we've figured some of these out. Why are you still stuck back in an old interpretation?
Mm-hmm.
But she has this formulation of, your brain is not primarily for thinking, it's for making predictions to help make really complicated budgetary decisions about how to allot resources in the body. So, from things like sugar and water and glucose and oxygen, right? And thinking is kind of secondary to all that. But she says what our brains are doing with limited data, limited sight, sound, sensations that's coming in, trying to predict what's coming next based on what's happened previously. So the way she frames this is to make a distinction. And I'd love to get your thoughts coming so recently out of, studying this more closely. This distinction between feeling and emotion. And I know that in popular language, we kind of blur the two very easily. And I don't know that other people agree with her terminology, but I like that we make a distinction at all.
Mm-hmm.
And the distinction is that feeling, she would say, is something that you can literally feel in your body. It might be vague, but it's a sensation that is considered to contain emotion, contain affect, contain some kind of more than just physical, right? And then that's a feeling. What she would say an emotion would be is taking that sensation, trying to predict based on it. I think she would call that sensation interoceptive. So there's some sensation in the body, and the brain is like, okay, what is this feeling? Or the brain's trying to prepare, and how it's preparing, we call that feeling. So using past experience, current details, trying to predict what's coming next. So how I tell myself to apply this, there are sensations in my body that I can feel that seem to be conveying pleasant or unpleasant emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the stories that I kind of get preoccupied trying to make sense of that sensation. And I
Mm-hmm.
think we are often in a rush to make sense that we don't practice literally sensing, where do I feel that? How strong is it? What would I call that? I just say I love the smoothie? How many smooth emotional smoothies have I had to inhabit where it helps so much to say, oh, there's like 4 or 5 ingredients in that, and I'm treating it like one thing. So,
Hmm. So here
yeah.
the distinction, let me say if I get this right, because this is again something that you can read all the books on emotions and feelings in the world and you'll come up with different descriptors every time, which makes it very complicated to get into the psychology space. But I do like this distinction. And for me, it feels like the feeling component is about, all right, the sensory elements that are culminating within like a full embodied experience, and then maybe a brief analysis of, so what we call is like the affect, and the affect is the valence and intensity of these sensations, right? So the valence would be, does it feel positive or does it feel negative? And
Yeah.
then the intensity is how much of it is there. So is it a lot? Or is it like a downgrade? Is it a lessening or a dulling? So that is what you're then taking to go through the next process of sense making or storytelling, right? To turn it into an emotion. And then that's where we get to the emotions point.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we are comfortable with the emotion because I can tell you how I feel because my dog is barking. Actually, it doesn't really bother me that he's barking. So I don't really have a great, I'm not having, it's like, but because I know that you and I have talked about dogs could bark during this. But if I take, if I want to connect with you over lunch, again, to that social conversation, I can tell you a story to catch you up to date. And that story implies emotion,
Mm-hmm.
but we skip right over this thing because it would be weird to, I think you and I could do it, but we could have lunch and say, I was giving a talk and in the middle of the talk, someone looked at me funny. And then I felt heat in my face. I felt my heart kind of, it felt like my heart was beating harder, even though I don't know if that's possible, but it felt, I was very aware, tangibly aware of my heart beating.
Mm-hmm.
And I was starting to filter through a little Rolodex of what does that look on that person's face mean?
Yes.
Um, and, and sometimes I think like in the sort of a performance, I think performers are sitting on a gold mine of these things that they just discover. Like if I adjust the microphone and slow down my pace, I can actually feel my heart beating and notice that my cheeks are hot and not rush to make a story about it. I can just feel it
Mm-hmm.
and maybe even convert that what I would kind of instinctively resist and escalate myself. I could just notice it and incorporate it into my presentation. But I would think I'm getting away from the thing that it would be socially weird to sit down and say, "Oh, I felt this heat in my face. Oh, I felt this, fluttering in my stomach."
Mm.
That's not the way we connect socially about our emotions. So I think that's
No.
partly what makes this challenging. Yeah,
Yeah, it doesn't seem like something just a casual conversation involves. It's very much, you see these descriptors in literature when you're reading, and I think that that's again why we've spoken in the past about people higher in neuroticism potentially engaging with things like, different art forms in a more intensive way because they're
exactly.
like, wow, I have had those kinds of tingling sensations, or I felt like my heart has sunk down about 3 stories in.
Yeah. And you even mentioned like the idea of intentionally seeking out a scary movie to sort of delight in the fear, right? Because we can modulate it. Or, I tend to like songs that are a little folksy and weepy and minor chords. I don't know why it appeals to me. So sometimes we like that. We like to trigger it in ourselves
Mhm.
for a sense of release. But
Mm.
as a mindfulness coach, I find it really interesting because I will often be telling people to notice what they feel, and they'll report an unpleasant feeling, and
Mhm.
I'll say, awesome, excellent, because in the context of mindful awareness and developing attentional skills, the ability to spot and detect, you said the word valence. People are like, what's that word mean? But it's sort of a kind, it's the humans can recognize this subtle detail. Sometimes I think of it as we're living in this sophisticated biofeedback device that is communicating information, but we don't really know how to interpret it. And we
No.
turn to our culture for terms and stories and relatability, but we're kind of guessing. And in
Hmm.
fact, I would say what we, even more than guessing, we really do not like to feel that whole range of unpleasant emotion. So we go to work on what should I do about it? Who's to blame for it? I
Yeah.
shouldn't have to be feeling this. What do I do to make it stop?
Yes.
And so I'm inviting people to say, ooh, fascinating. I feel terror. And for the purposes of cultivating a kind of relationship to myself, like an intimacy with yourself, your own emotional experience, being able to recognize more specific flavors and tones and intensity levels, I cannot stress how huge this is and how beneficial. I read somewhere this week on social media someone posting being able to regulate emotions is crime prevention. It helps address addictions. It helps us to be civil
Hmm.
adult human beings and
Mm.
respect people we disagree with.
Yes.
So that's what I feel like is on the other side of getting more intimately familiar with our feelings. Can I share one analogy? And then I also want to ask you about if you can think of an example where this distinction has been, tangible or like very palpable for you. But this analogy I like to think of is that what we're talking about today is by no means any kind of a substitute for seeing a competent therapist. We're just talking about the fact that isn't it fascinating that we have these complex feelings? We go to the doctor when we're sick, but we also know that we can make choices and exercise and eat healthy in a way that helps us get sick less. It doesn't prevent everything, right?
Hmm.
But then sometimes we need to see a personal trainer, physical therapist to develop the capacity for having more of a sense of thriving in our lives. So I like to make this distinction. I don't stop going to the doctor just because I exercise. And the same thing, I don't stop going to see a therapist just because I'm getting more intimately familiar with my feelings. In fact, the more intimately familiar with my feelings I get as a person with big feelings, I probably am going to get a lot more out of those therapy sessions.
Hmm.
So, um, so I think part of the conversation is hard because we don't really talk about what are healthy ways to develop capacities for greater emotional awareness, greater regulation. We think of it in terms of when things get bad, we seek help. Does that make
Mm.
sense?
Yes. And there's something else that you said there. I don't want to take you off track, but I think that this is an important thing. Is there's part of me that feels a little bit of fear. So what am I feeling? How do I know that that's fear? I guess uh, a kind of unease in my chest and something in my stomach area when you were talking about, getting closer with the feelings. The idea that if your relationship has been with big feelings, with big negatively valenced feelings, that the prospect of going closer to them
Hmm.
feels like a dangerous feat. And
Yes.
I know rationally, given my training and understanding of the things I've learned, that there's a lot to be gained out of it. But just the instinctive response to this
Yeah.
invitation already elicits a sense of a felt uh, fear,
Yeah.
cautiousness. Mm.
You know what I hear in that? And yeah, you help me make sure I'm not getting too far afield. But what analogy I think for this is let's say let's say jalapeno pepper. Let's say that you enjoy meals that include some spicy challenge, right? As an adult, we would never give a child this, well, maybe that varies by culture. How I was raised, I would not have been given a hot, spicy jalapeno pepper in the middle of a
Hmm.
dish because that is something I would choose to cultivate a palate for later in my adult life.
Yeah,
And what you're talking about, I think, is in this category. Like, why would I feel that thing closely when I've been trying not to feel it kind
yeah,
of my whole life?
yes.
The counterinstinctive thing feels connected to safety, protection, survival instinct.
Hmm.
So we're saying, okay, now that I'm an adult, I've got things kind of together. I want to turn toward this feeling that's kind of intimidated me in the past. And, I would also add, I don't need to white knuckle every feeling I'm feeling every day, all day. It's sort
Mm-hmm.
of like sometimes turning towards that feeling and letting it sort of intimidate us a little and sort of getting acquainted with it so that it becomes less and less intimidating with familiarity.
Sure.
Um, so yeah, no, I love it. It the other thing I always feel like I have to come with warning labels because people will say they're waiting for me to reveal something that's going to get them an exemption from the feelings they don't. How do I solve this?
Yes.
It's what we're constantly doing, right?
Darren,
And it's
everyone's going to
like
turn off the episode now, but they're like, is that not what we're getting today?
but it's like I think the way I come to see it now at this point in my life, which you couldn't have convinced me this 20 years ago, I don't think. But I hope I hoped it was a riddle and there was a way for me to outsmart. I don't want grief, sadness, fear, anxiety, right?
Mm.
But now I see it as this fascinating and powerful skill that if we develop it prepares us to respond in ways that I think can really blow people's minds and there's can be a satisfaction of realizing, here's an example. I think it was it Stephen Colbert or it may have been Will Ferrell? Sorry, guys. A funny guy. There was a funny guy who told a story, kind of as an aside, that he used to be mortified by embarrassment. Let's just say it's Stephen Colbert. I think I'm feeling that that's it. Um, so he intentionally created scenarios where he could trigger that emotion to
Mm-hmm.
feel it and lean into it for
Mm.
exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
This feels dangerous,
Yeah.
and when I feel it, I'm like, oh my God, this did not kill me. And I kind of feel alive. So
Yeah.
like he would talk to people in elevators, that kind of thing. Just intentionally generate embarrassment so that he could feel it more and fight with it less. And I find that to be a super interesting. Again, actors, musicians, they're always sneaking and finding these tricks
There
about
was
how to relate to feelings. Yeah.
there was a therapy as well that had a trendy moment on TikTok, I think, where people did rejection therapy, where they put themselves in positions where they knew they were going to get rejected.
Oh
Like,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
again, I find it because so many
Exactly.
people carry around such fear of this feeling of rejection that people were
Right.
going, okay, well, how do I practice rejection so that it doesn't feel so
100%.
intimidating?
Talk about what could be more empowering. And then if you think about it, what could be more realistic, actually? Just get all the rejection out of the way so you can get busy with the real stuff, with the good
Mm,
stuff. Um, but yeah, we want an exemption. We want an exemption from what hurts. And as a kind of neurotically inclined person with big feelings, I think I spent a significant amount of my life trying not to feel.
yeah.
So I think we have to give ourselves the cushion of a lot of time to practice feeling in the ways you and I are describing. So this is so personal, maybe, but maybe it's not your biggest, most intense thing. But do you have a memory of a situation that was emotional that you had an awareness of the felt sense of your feelings during it?
I do have, well, I've got some as a memory of being a child. And I think that we've spoken about in maybe our first episode, that feeling of anxiety and having a really bodily recognition of how that felt. But there's been a more recent example that I wanted to share with you today, just because it's something that I haven't felt in probably around 10 years. And so my invitation to experience it has been shaped by the sort of learning and understanding and growth that I've been through
Mm.
over these past 10 years. So I said, I think in a previous episode, that I'm back on some of the dating apps.
Oh yeah.
And I met up with someone recently who I'd seen a couple of times already. And I'm not cowboying out there and ready to lock myself in any way. But after the last date, I noticed the next day feeling some kind of ways. And it was something that felt foreign to me. It's, that
Mm.
feeling of, I guess, a sense of attraction and arousal. And this has been quite a while since I've been out in the dating
Mm.
game, and also risk. So I'll kind of give you a little summary of what I was
Yeah.
feeling.
I'm
It
hanging
was
on every word, by the way. So
so
take your time.
so I knew this episode was coming up, and so I journaled and I sat with it, and a feeling of almost tingling underneath my skin, like fully through my skin. There was a sort of lightness and flickering through my chest, and
Mm,
also a degree of, I want to say nervousness, because that's already putting the label on it, but almost churning, a churning feeling in my stomach. So I felt enlivened by these internal
mm,
sensations. It felt like there was a sense of aliveness to it. And
hmm.
I suppose what Esther Perel would call a sense of like eroticism, that feeling of
Sure.
vitality. However, I was very fascinated to reflect on the fact that a lot of those same sensations are what I feel when I feel anxious, like
Hmm,
just the
hmm,
feelings. So
hmm.
again, that kind of jitteriness under the skin, that fluttery feeling
Yeah.
in the chest. And I was like, wow, I am not calling this anxiety.
Uh-huh.
However, it meets a lot of the criteria.
Yeah, no kidding. And you mentioned you used the phrase you hadn't felt these things in a while. And as you're talking about it, I'm talking about the times I think instantly of the times in my life I felt something similar. And I haven't, it's that initial attraction, possibility, vulnerable. There's so much that we abstract there. But when you examine the sensations and describe them as accurately and well, it's so interesting. As you describe it accurately, then I can relate more to it without even needing a lot of I can fill in the details myself,
Mhm.
even, you know, um, and isn't it true? What could feel worse than like crush, unrequited love, realizing you're attracted to what could feel worse? What could feel better? Well, it's like such a vulnerable and exciting combination. I'm probably going to use the term smoothie even after our conversation today because I think it's so perfect. It's like, you know, strawberry banana. Let's throw in a little bit of something granola. But it's like there's also the possibility, I think, that sometimes we're so busy trying to push away unpleasant feelings because of the association, because of the abstraction, the story we're starting to tell, that we don't realize how you use the word enlivening or energizing, how sometimes our anxiety can be laced with energy or even enthusiasm,
Mm.
right? It makes it hard to I don't know. There's something about if I'm anxious a lot in my life, there's a familiarity about that that can also be part of that, makes it hard. But what I do hear in your description is how it's open for interpretation and it sort of starts to feel like you're stepping into the unknown by just relying on the physical details as opposed to telling us the story.
Hmm.
But yeah, what a great example of how I bet this is true about a lot of things. We flatten. Once we have a word, anxious, oh, okay. And we put everything into that category and we
Hmm.
flatten the experience.
Yeah.
And what we're talking about is trying to bring more of a nuance and richness and realizing, wow, these two things are kind of cousins, one
Mm.
I like and one I really don't like. And
I
they're
think
almost indistinguishable.
I think as well, this seems more accessible for me to reflect on with a sense of curiosity because I understand that the story of these emotions is usually associated with something more positive. I mean, not to say that I won't be ghosted in like 2 days, I'll never hear back from this
Sure.
person, but in terms of how not only myself, but also culturally, my friends and my family and people that I would speak to would receive me talking and thinking
Mm,
about what I'm going through. There is, like you said, a sense of uh, possibility, a sense of
mm,
excitement. And
hmm.
so when I'm feeling the feelings, even though my actual felt experience could be verging on the unpleasant, like I don't feel calm, I don't feel
Yeah.
grounded. I feel like I can move a little bit closer, even though, like you said, the landscape might be similar to anxiety, but if I was to go, I'm feeling anxious because, or
Yeah.
I think that my husband is going to leave me, or I think that I'm doing a bad job at parenting, or I think that I'm going to have failed this exam. The idea of going there with those feelings for me feels a little more like the next level up, challenge
Hmm.
wise.
And yeah, you've also said something I want to put on the table more explicitly. You said you've used the word, I don't feel calm, I don't feel relaxed. And this is one of my biggest beefs with mindfulness right now, is it sounds like I'm subscribing to calm on demand as if calm equals mindfulness
You're a
or
calm
breath
coach.
awareness. Yeah, right. Yeah. Or that breath awareness equals mindfulness. And I think mindfulness is being more intimately familiar with what it feels like to be alive, regardless of the circumstance. So instead of picturing someone on a spa vacation with cucumbers on her eyes, chilling to Anya music and having a massage, whatever, that's this kind of like child's version of what we hope mindfulness will be. But I like the analogy better of imagining a tightrope walker. And now, as I say this a lot, so please forgive me if I've used this on one of our previous conversations. But this idea that I'm taking one step in front of the other, I'm stepping into uncertainty, and I've got to respect the signals my body is giving me. But it's also kind of exciting. Each step is exciting and destabilizing, and I can zoom in and regulate and modulate. And feeling alive can feel exhilarating and terrifying. And we can be laughing, we can be turned on, we can be terrified. There's like, and sometimes there can be several at once, all happening at the same time.
Mhm.
And I want people to know you can be mindful of relaxation. Good for you. Enjoy. But you can also be mindful of any possible emotion that you feel. So it's not like I was mindful and then I got excited about my body was excited about the possibility of being, feeling attractive and feeling the possibility of being closer to this person who I'm kind of finding myself fond of. It's like I can be destabilized and confused and uncertain and excited and still mindful of that whole smoothie.
Mhm.
um and it's delicious and intimidating. And what's the alternative if I feel, oh, I'm going to classify this as anxious and stay home?
Mhm.
That's fine. Okay. We have to practice interpreting and see where that leads. It's all kind of a laboratory, I think.
Mhm.
um
It
but
it makes
yeah.
me think of that famous study that I know you're familiar with too. The one where they got the dudes to walk across the rickety, scary
Yes.
bridge,
Oh, I love that
and then
study.
then they got the phone number from the female researcher on the other side of the bridge, and they wanted to see how many of the dudes would call her back because they confused that feeling of fear
Yes.
of going through a fearful scenario of walking across a scary bridge with arousal. And
Yeah.
funny how those rates of callbacks that female researcher received were higher when the dudes were put through the gauntlet of having to go across the scary bridge.
I can't tell you how often I think about that study, and I don't remember when I learned it a million years ago, but I think about it. I think it actually comes into play a lot for people. And
Hmm.
it's like one of the things you wouldn't tell your friend who you think, are you like what part of this are you going towards this because because it's a risk?
Yeah.
What are you actually interpreting here? But we all do have to learn how to interpret our own signs and signals. But oh my gosh, what an important element to keep in mind, that how it's almost like their cousins, fear and attraction are so similar in the body that we have to be careful a little bit, proceed with caution sometimes,
Hmm.
um, with
And
some
that's
of that.
that's like the
Yeah.
the red flags for some people. Maybe
Yeah.
instinctively they know that the red flags mean danger, and yet sometimes
Yep.
danger feels like, woo, let's go.
Exactly. Well, yeah. Oh my gosh, there's so much to unpack there. I want to kind of steer us towards like, okay, so let's say to whoever's listening, God, thanks for listening, and I hope you're listening. I hope you're telling people that you find this interesting and useful. Let us know what you find useful. But if I were to give people like, what's some little secret task or secret little exploration you could start now? I'm thinking of how people think about I'm going to be mindful next year. I'm going to start in January. I say start now, start small, and don't tell anybody you're doing it. And what I would give people as a possible task or secret mission would be to start noticing sensations in your body that feel purely physical, and which sensations can you detect in your body that seem to you obviously to have some kind of emotional flavor, valence, tone. You don't have to know what that flavor is, and you also don't have to be right, because I don't think there is a right, but you have to be curious enough to notice, okay, I have a tension in my shoulders. Does that seem emotional? I have weepiness. I have my eyes. I feel like I could cry, or I feel this terror or fear or low grade dread in my chest. To start getting curious about the fact that my body is capable of broadcasting things that are purely physical and it can be pleasant or unpleasant, right? Or sometimes some of those sensations seem to be obviously emotional. What
Mhm.
was something you said? I was wondering how it's sort of like guessing, right? When you notice the tingling right under your skin, that fluttering feeling, how how do we make this distinction between physical and conveying affect? Is that what is, yeah.
Yeah, I think a good example would be if you've been on a jog, maybe you're not a runner and you're running really fast and your heart's speeding up and you're starting to get short of breath. Often that scenario is this has happened because I've just been jogging for the past
Yeah.
15 minutes. And we don't usually rush to make that an emotional experience. And yet, say you just got some terrible news and you've just broke down crying and your breath is shortening and your heart is racing, that feels emotional. So I think that, yeah, that distinction
Yeah.
between the purely physical and things that are just caused by our bodies, and then the other part, which seems to have a bit more of that emotional flavor. That's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, and and I think it reminds me of trying to become a connoisseur, developing a really refined palate. So the way you might be able to taste flavor in wine or tease out ingredients, it's like, oh, I think there's cinnamon in these muffins, right? It's like that. So it's a lot of guesswork, but what I found is the more willingness you're able to treat it like a game. It's a game, not a test. So make a game out of collecting as much sensory, and by as much, I mean like a couple times a day. Notice, am I feeling a sensation that I would call physical or is it emotional? Something else that occurs to me as we're talking about this that feels related. I've worked with people who really do struggle with anxiety and are seeing a therapist for it. And we're trying to like complement that by what we're doing with sensitizing exercises. And the heart, the chest, and the heart. For people with anxiety, they often start out by being convinced they're having a heart attack. And then they
Mm-hmm.
go through a whole series of tests. And then the doctors say, no, this is not, this is purely physical, and it leaves the person with some vague sense of I should try a little mindfulness. But part of what I think is happening there is when we feel that even blurry, it's physical or emotional, I'm not sure, but it's at my heart. And I want to be clear. If you have any kind of concern about your heart, please go to get that checked out with a
Mm-hmm.
doctor. But if you've ruled out the fact that there's no physical problem, then I think what happens in anxiety a lot is we resist that discomfort, which then amplifies and escalates. The intensity gets bigger.
Mm-hmm.
For those of us with a tendency towards big emotions,
Mm-hmm.
big sadness, right? Big fear, how we habitually respond can really determine if we're going to perpetually escalate ourselves and see ourselves as, oh my gosh, I'm a person who can't help but be, intensely anxious all the time. Well, maybe it feels like that way at the beginning, but what if there's the feeling you're feeling in your body and the impulse to interpret it and rush to what it means and how to get rid of it? But what if we sort of gradually over time, like you mentioned, it's intimidating, it's counter-instinctual. But what if I get familiar and curious with it instead? My resistance comes down, my escalation comes down,
Mm-hmm.
my sense of forming an identity around I'm a I'm an anxious person starts to get thinner too, which can be such a relief to
Mm.
observe your feeling instead of rush to make an identity out of it or to escalate it.
Yeah, it feels
So,
like you probably need a bit of a container to start to do this first, because I guess ideally
yep.
what all of us want to be able to do, especially those of us who have a track record of feeling our feelings very big and intense. You want to be able to walk on that stage and see that person look at you in a bit of a snuffy way and not completely get overtaken by that emotion. You want to be able to clock it in the moment. And again, I think that this is a distinction that needs to be made, is that if you are a person who tends towards the neurotic, that it might not actually be possible for anyone to train you to not have that emotional response. So
Right.
I think that is what I went to therapy for. I said, I want you to train me to respond differently when I am feeling something. And I
Yeah.
didn't realize, and it took me years to realize that maybe that glare from that audience member is always going to trigger that
100%.
feeling. But where we go from there, that's where we can be empowered. But I think that it's hard to train in those high intensity, high visibility
Oh gosh.
scenarios.
100%. Oh my God, Ash, it's so much so true. I'm so glad you brought that up. And I also want to because whenever I talk about this, I get so excited and I talk about the big possibilities, but I really encourage people to not start with their biggest, most daunting, intimidating thing because the reality is, spoiler alert, you are going to probably have to learn to live with how you feel. I'm sorry, I hate to break it to people, but actually that's so empowering to start to live with. But to do what I'm talking about, simply collect a little data every day about what's
Mhm.
physical in the body versus what's emotional. Start small, take brief nibbles at this, and start with things that are in your mild to moderate. The daily annoyances of life are
Mhm.
plenty to work on here. We don't have to talk about our big defining things as we get started. And as you're kind of implying, you might want to do that work with a professional to unpack some of that stuff and get some objective feedback about how that's going and what to do. But I like to work with things like stuck in traffic or traffic's moving slow. The line I'm in is going slow. I'm watching a series we've just started the second season of Bad Sisters. And so I'm fascinated by how at the end of every episode, it's by design, it's provoking emotion that
Mhm.
I want some relief from. So
Mhm.
to me, that's a place where I can take a little sample of what does it feel like to want Netflix is trying to decide for me, we're going to go on to the next one.
Yeah.
You have to stop it, you have to
Yeah.
bring the friction.
Yeah.
But so to feel that feeling of cliffhanger feeling is such a rich place to play. And there's so many things in life, waking up in the morning, waking up in the middle of the night. There's so many occasions in life to just take a little emotional sample by feeling what you feel in the body somewhere, taking a stab at guessing, where do I feel it? What would I call that? How
Okay,
strong
so
is it?
can you
Yeah.
do the little sample with me right now,
Yeah.
Darren? Because I think that I like the sound of these exercises and I've heard them before. They're not really something that I feel like I engage in that often. Not in a sort of deeply conscious sense. I did a little bit
Yeah.
more this week because I knew I had to talk about it. Okay, so let's just say, given my current context about my recent dating experience, I'm waiting for a text message and my phone vibrates. So I feel that feeling. I notice that that does something to my body. The vibration of the phone triggers maybe a kind of fluttering in my stomach, um, a kind of lightheadedness potentially.
Yeah.
And so then obviously those feelings are pulling me to engage with my phone to see what the vibration was signifying. So from that, do you also want people to then go, well, what do those sensations mean to you? Do you want people
Oh,
to sense make?
oh my gosh, such an excellent question. I think we do so much sense making and we always will that I'm suggesting sometimes opting out of the sense making.
Okay.
Just sometimes, just for kicks, just for fun, just to see where it leads, to start to see. because I think so, especially those of us with big feelings, we don't even know what that's like to suspend that
Mm,
briefly, even briefly, right? So,
okay.
to just, I would think, here's what I think. Mindfulness sounds cognitive, intellectual, abstract, whatever, touchy-feely, and it's when we are willing to engage in it and practice it, it's tangible, it's palpable, it's visceral. So I would say you can, I would give you points, extra credit, mindful points, whatever, for when that phone goes off and you simply notice I'm having an emotional experience right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to start interpret it and I might start interpreting it in about
Mm-hmm.
30 seconds or a
Mm-hmm.
minute because you can't stop me,
Mm,
but I want to take a little sample. Oh, back in the old days when I started meditating, it would be a phone would ring in the house in the like a landline. And the practice was just don't answer it. Let it ring a few times. And I
mm,
remember the first few times it felt so rude and excruciating to let a phone ring. I felt like alarm just to answer a phone in the house.
mm,
And I think it's in the family of that. What you're suggesting is this, I think this you're also kind of putting on the table. There's this automaticity of life where my phone chirps or vibrates and I just respond like Pavlov's dog.
yeah.
And what if mindfulness is really pause, unhook from the automaticity for a few seconds
Mm-hmm.
and acknowledge this is what a human emotion feels like.
Mm,
And I might start to get familiar with, oh, I feel a combination of pleasant and unpleasant here. But it might just simply be I have visceral data that I'm collecting for no other reason than because my nervous system is so much more sophisticated than I realize, and I
mm,
don't really realize until I give it a lot of data to like process through. That just simply acknowledging that physical and emotional feel different in the body can set the stage for someday in the future. I'm investing a few seconds and a few minutes here and there. In the future, my mechanism for relating to my emotion just gets more robust. It just
mm.
gets more sophisticated. Like the way your palate gets more rich and you enjoy a meal better because you've paid close attention to all the ingredients.
Yeah, but
It's
Darren,
like,
what about
yeah,
the
yeah.
fact that you can finesse your palate like that might also mean that when you go to a low grade restaurant, you're gonna not enjoy it more than someone who doesn't have that
That
refined
is
taste.
that is true. That is true. And you know, I want to be clear, mindfulness does not numb feelings. Sometimes we have to be willing to feel those feelings strongly to take them less personally. And it's an acquired taste. It's an acquired taste, let's be honest. But what you're also implying, maybe I don't want to eat this meal. Maybe I want, or, maybe I don't have a choice. But if I do have a choice, I can decide how to proceed based on my refined palate. Which, right? If we talk about in your dating world, there's choices that can be made. There's choices that can be made based on the data you collect. And I'm not talking about perfectionism, and I'm not talking about numbing. I'm talking about be ready because some of the feelings might be more nuanced and complicated. Something we said earlier in this conversation, I think, is also worth repeating here. Sometimes we rush to, oh my gosh, I'm so excited. And it can step back and say, is that the best word I have? Or are there two or three ingredients in this emotion?
Mm,
And it could just simply be one of the things I've noticed is I often have pleasant and unpleasant emotions simultaneously. And I don't think
mhm,
the psychologists ever give me any clues for this, but in my body, that's how it plays out.
mhm.
Maybe that's part of a neurotic personality type.
I think
But yeah,
as well, we
yeah,
also talk about conflicting emotions, and it makes it out like there's some sort of little
yeah,
battle going on where, oh, the good
exactly.
guys of positivity and gratitude and joy and excitement are head to head with anxiety and fear and embarrassment. And I think that it doesn't really help us understand the emotional experience very accurately.
Yeah. What if mixed emotions are just mixed and apparently contradicting? And some of the best art, music, novels, whatever, aren't they so complicated because you just can't quite summarize it
Oh, I
and you
would
can't
say
resolve it?
all the best
Yeah,
ones are. You would not,
all the
no
best.
one could tell me their favorite book, their favorite song, their favorite movie that does not involve a mixture of the emotional experience. And so I think that it's interesting that when we actually are embodying those contradictions within ourselves, that can be seen. And I think it's because it feels like, or maybe we create the story of this tension, this pushing against, which also doesn't feel good. And we don't want to conflict. We want to resolve. We want to go
We want to
where we
resolve.
want to go with this feeling. We want to
Uh-huh.
make it. And I suppose with your sense making of the emotions, that's almost like a point of resolution. It's like, oh no,
Yep.
this is excitement. Oh no, that was anxiety. And you're telling the story and you're putting that full
Yep.
stop or period at the end, like done.
And exactly. And nobody wants to read that book. Nobody wants to read that story. And it doesn't feel very alive. It feels like I don't want my life to feel like a poorly written community theater play where the acting is kind of suspect and the dialogue is kind of shoddy. I want it to feel like who knows what's going to happen next. But, maybe we should wind down with a couple of things that I've been thinking about as takeaways for this discussion. I would say if this is of interest to you, really all I'm suggesting is be curious about the difference between physical and emotional sensations in your body and be confused. Be confused for a long time and just
Hmm.
guess.
Hmm.
The guessing will be such, you will not regret it. The catch yourself, something you just said. We're rushing to resolve the discomfort. What if we sometimes don't need that kind of resolution of the removal of the emotion? The emotion is already there. Maybe we just need to feel it. So maybe it's something in the category of catharsis that
Hmm.
we really need. We think we want to resolve, but we really just need to feel and maybe get a sense of letting that emotion run its course. Um, so when you find yourself having an emotion that you wish wasn't there and you find yourself going into who caused this, how do I get rid of it, whatever, see if you're willing to, even for a few seconds or half a minute or a minute or more, whatever, turn towards it just to collect a little data, a little sensory data. um, when you find yourself looping, there's these scenarios in your mind, lot of little mental movies that you're making. Can you try to see if you can feel in your body, is there some emotional juice coming from my body that's fueling that narrative? And then
Hmm.
would I be willing to feel it?
Yeah.
Right. And then the sometimes the scenario in the mind generates emotion in the body. So it kind of works both ways. I don't
Hmm.
think it's either or. I think it
No.
goes both ways. And then my last one is something I just reiterate that I've said as we've been talking. But when you find yourself, oh, I'm going to crack this code and I'm not going to have to make myself miserable anymore. Kind of step back, slow down, start with your moderate, mild annoyances, emotional triggers. Life is full of these things that evoke emotion. All of them are useful in this kind of experiment. So start with the mild ones. And when you're stuck at a boring meeting. What does it feel like to be stuck at this boring meeting? Or,
Hmm.
um, cringy moments with family over the holidays or whatever, pressure to buy more presents when you're kind of, already know you've got enough presents. Just being willing to sometimes turn into those mundane emotional moments that we sort of bypass and just investigate, collect a little data and see what happens. And I think you and I would both love to hear if people are even willing to do something like this at all and to report. That would be awesome. It's one of my favorite things in the world to hear people report because they're always like, I don't know if this counts, but when I noticed this, I felt that. I'm like, it
It
counts.
counts.
It
It feels
counts.
to me, we know so much about physical fitness, and I know that sort of your tagline is attentional fitness. It feels to me like the emotional and attentional equivalent of I'll take the stairs today instead of taking the
Yeah,
elevator, or I'll get the
totally.
salad even though I really feel like the burger and chips. And so you're
Yep.
taking that moment to actually make a choice to be with something that may be less pleasant as you're living and
Yep.
experiencing through it, and it's going to give you some greater level of connection with your body, understanding of your emotions, and understanding of yourself, essentially.
Totally. And it's such an empowering you said it beautifully. We know physical exercise requires that kind of discomfort, but we know that it's building something. And I don't think we really appreciate the degree to which what if you built a capacity for literally feeling your, when I was, when I was younger, I would have told you, I'm in touch with I would have told you straight face that I'm in touch with my feelings. And
Yeah,
now I
same.
look back at that person and I'm like, oh my God, don't listen to him. He is completely driven by all his feelings and trying not to feel what he feels. And
Yes.
he has not stopped to literally feel them ever. And
Yeah.
look where he's going with that. But
I'll
yeah,
tell
so
you, it
no.
doesn't take you good places.
But no, what you just said is so spot on. Take the stairs sometimes. Feel your feelings sometimes. You will not regret either, even though while you're doing it, you're like, what is this?
Hate that.
What have I signed up
I
for?
still don't get the salad. So thank you, Darren. I've loved this episode so much. And wow, the places that we can go with this topic now that we've sort of
Yeah,
started. I love the idea of talking about, okay, so what happens when we bring people into the mix? What happens when people see us
totally.
being emotional or see us feeling our feelings? And what happens when we need to communicate with others to give them some sort of an idea of what we are going through in this embodied emotional experience? And something else
Huge.
that I think we could do a whole other episode on is actually escaping your feelings. So this idea of what we do to try to avoid the feeling, and the idea or the scary notion that you actually have to let the feeling pass through you. And that sounds disgusting, especially when they're not pleasant feelings. How long is that going to take? Can we speed up that process?
Uh-huh.
What are tactics
Uh-huh.
that we can use so that we can continue living our life and operating in the world whilst these feeling experiences are present within us?
And I'll throw in a couple, and this is killing me because I want to talk for 2 more hours with you right now.
Yeah.
But the things that come to my mind are, what if I simply got better at noticing emotional responses that are earned versus manipulations? Huge. Like I use this all the time with, like, there are movies that move me to tears that I think, yes, you may have my heart, whatever, and I don't regret it at all.
Yes.
And then there's movies like, don't you tell me what to feel, right? There's that, and then there's also, I want to put on our list this trap that people with big feelings get, where we're convinced we know what other people are feeling because I can just walk into a room and I
Ah,
feel in my body what you're feeling. No, you don't.
yes, the
Let's
empath
talk about
trap.
that. Yeah, exactly. We have to put that on our list. It's huge, and it's
Huge.
actually a relief to kind of see through that illusion. I think so.
For sure. And if anyone's listening out there that has some topics that you want us to get into,
Yeah.
we want to start these conversations. We also want to make it known that if you're out there and you are feeling big feelings, sometimes it's a mark of shame or something that we want to repress from the world. And I hope that some of these conversations, and hopefully if we can create a bit of a community around it, we can understand that actually we're not bad, we're not broken, we're not flawed. We just engage with the world in different ways. And sometimes we can do with learning some skills and strategies around how to be with ourselves a little better.
You are not alone. And I will tell you a secret. The world needs your big feelings. We just need to have some skills around getting better at how we actually relate to those and how we express those. But the benefits are huge. The world needs people with big feelings. Let's just leave it at that. So thanks, Ash.
Too good,
I enjoyed this
Darren.
conversation so much. All right, take care.